Hi, this is lesson 4.1c, sampling surveys, so still section 1 in chapter 4. And in today's lesson, you're going to learn how to explain how undercoverage and non-response and the question wording and other aspects of sample surveys can lead to bias. So, sample surveys, what can go wrong? Well, undercoverage is one of the very bad things that can happen during sampling. Undercoverage occurs when some members of the population cannot be chosen in a sample. So if you're systematically ignoring a group, that means that undercoverage is happening. Here are some examples. Sample survey of households, for example, will miss not only homeless people, but also prison inmates and students in dormitories. So if you are going to conduct a survey and by saying you're going to go to households, you are ignoring specific groups of people. And so just keep that in mind when you are doing these kind of surveys, because these lead to undercoverage. Another one is an opinion poll conducted by calling landline telephone numbers will miss households that have only cell phones, as well as households without a phone even. So again, undercoverage happening because not everybody is eligible to be chosen. So most samples do suffer from some degree of undercoverage. Sadly, it's really hard to combat all of the undercoverage, but you have to try your best to think about as many things that could possibly go wrong when you're conducting surveys. And if the people that are not covered differ from the rest of the population, there will be bias due to undercoverage. So if you're systematically ignoring all students in dormitories, there's undercoverage and there'll be bias. Your answers are going to be biased because you're not covering students in dormitories, or your answer might be biased because prison inmates are not included, or your answers might be biased because homeless people may not be included. So you can't say that all people have a specific like you can't generalize your survey results to all people if you're not including all people. That's what I'm trying to say, okay? All right, another type of problem that can occur is non-response. Non-response occurs when an individual chosen for the sample can't be contacted or refuses to participate. So non-response to surveys often is more than 50%, even with careful planning. And so people don't want to sometimes participate. They choose not to. Or, sorry, there's something up with my throat. These videos, my voice keeps leaving me. Just so you know that this shouldn't be confused with voluntary response. Non-response is like you've been chosen, but you don't want to participate, or you can't be contacted because whatever, like they're trying to get a hold of you, but you're not answering, for example. Whereas voluntary response sample is that people volunteer to respond to a sample, for example, like a survey. So they're different things. Okay, so let's read a story, well, an example, rather. So the Census Bureau's American Community Survey, ACS for short, American Community Survey, has the lowest non-response rate of any poll we know. So lowest non-response means a lot of people are responding. Only about 1% of the households in the sample refuse to respond, which is really, really good. Like 1% refusing to talk or, answer the questions is really good. So the overall non-response rate, including never at home and other causes, is just 2.5%. This monthly survey of about 250,000 households replaces the long form that in the past was sent to some households in the ever 10 years national census. Participation in this ACS is mandatory, and the Census Bureau follows up by telephone and then in person if a household doesn't return the mail return the mail questionnaire. The University of Chicago's General Social Survey is the nation's most important social science survey, and the GSS contacts its samples in person, and it is run by a university. Despite these advantages, its most recent survey had a 30% rate of non-response. So as you can see, this is just an example that shows you that even if you're a good sampler, like even if you can get good samples and contact people, it's really hard to get everybody to respond. With 30% rate of non-response, that means only 70% of the people responded, 30% refused to respond, or people were not able to get a hold of them, basically. The third type of problem that can create bias is not non-response, but response bias. Non-response is when people don't respond or you can't get a hold of them. Response bias, on the other hand, it's a systematic pattern of inaccurate answers in a survey that leads to response bias. So for example, some things that can affect and cause inaccuracies, the responses that people give, is their gender, race, age, ethnicity, behavior, or of the interviewer. So the interviewer, just because of their gender, race, age, ethnicity, and behavior, can influence the results of a survey. How so? Because people sometimes respond differently to different genders, races, ages, ethnicities, etc. Okay? So, unfortunately, this is reality. Some people have their own personal biases, and based on the interviewer, they might not respond accurately, and that can cause response bias. Another thing that can cause response bias is the wording of the question. Some questions are very confusing, and then they also say stuff like, isn't it true? Or they'll say, well, see, this is a negative thing, and then ask you a question whether or not you support it or not, just so that when you're leading something with a negative thought, you're going to invoke negative responses usually. So there are ways to manipulate people's responses just on how the wording of the question is. So that creates a strong bias. And then even the order in which the questions are asked matters. Okay, so here's an example. And before we go on with the example, don't trust the results of any survey until you read exactly the questions, what exact questions were being asked. Okay, so how do Americans feel about illegal immigrants? This is a specific example. Should illegal immigrants be prosecuted and deported for being in the U.S. illegally, or shouldn't they? See how it's worded? Should they or shouldn't they? Asked the question in an opinion poll, 69% favored deportation. But when the very same sample was asked whether illegal immigrants who have worked in the United States for 2 years should be given a chance to keep their jobs and eventually apply for legal status, 62% said they should. So you could see that a different question gets a different response. Like people who think that, illegal immigrants should be deported also almost strongly think that they should be allowed citizenship, eventually apply for legal status and stuff like that if they are who worked in the United States. So how you word the question matters drastically on how you're going to get a response.